Getting an early start on your EPA MARC grant application. The Environmental Protection Agency, commonly referred to as EPA, has several different funding opportunities relative to brownfield sites. EPA's multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup, commonly referred to as MARC grant solicitations, occur typically in the fall. The solicitation for assessment and cleanup grants occur annually. Multi-purpose grants and revolving loan fund grants occur every other year. Multi-purpose on odd number years and revolving loan funds, otherwise known as RLFs, on even years. The solicitation for these brownfield grants begins with the request for applications, or RFA, issued by EPA that includes the guidelines for each of the respective grant types. There is typically a 60-day window between the release of the RFA and the submission deadline for the applications. There's a lot of work to be done in that short timeline. However, there are many tasks the applicant can get started on prior to the release of the RFA. The goal of this video is to provide tips on things an applicant can do well in advance of the RFA. Getting an early start on your application will make the application process run smoother and will give the applicant a greater chance for submitting a successful application. EPA grant applications must be submitted through the System of Award Management, or www.sam.gov. If you are planning to submit an application for an EPA Brownfields grant, you can register in sam.gov long before the EPA issues its RFA. First, you must obtain your organization's DUNS number. A DUNS number is a unique 9-digit identifier for your entity. Once you have your DUNS number in hand, go to www.sam.gov and register. Even if your entity is already registered in sam.gov, make sure the account is active. It cannot be stressed enough that the applicant should register in SAM as early as possible to avoid potential problems with its submission. Additionally, the potential applicant should take the time to review the most current application frequently asked questions, or FAQs, at the URL shown on the slide. EPA has managed this process numerous times and makes great effort to update this information to make it as comprehensive and relevant as possible. So before you reach out to EPA with any questions, make sure you review the applicant FAQ page, as most likely your question has been asked and answered already. As stated earlier, there is limited time between the release of the RFA and the application submission date. Therefore, applicants should begin preparing as early as possible. In addition to getting registered in SAM and reviewing the FAQs, here are some tasks that applicants can begin prior to the release of EPA's RFA. Review EPA's previous solicitation year's guidelines and frequently asked questions. The Brownfield Grant Guidelines are updated each year. However, in past years, the core elements of the guidelines have stayed somewhat consistent. Reading the guidelines, thinking through and gathering the information required, and even putting together the plan for your Brownfields program and Brownfields project will give you a step up when it comes to preparing your application. Previous year's guidelines and FAQs are available on the EPA Office of Brownfield and Land Revitalization website at the URL shown on the slide. It is also recommended that applicants review past successful grant applications to get a good idea of what a winning grant looks like. Samples of successful MARC grants can be found at the NJIT tab website by following the URL provided on the slide. Develop the framework for your Brownfields program or project plan. This framework may include elements such as identifying the target area, identifying a priority site or sites. If you haven't identified a priority site or sites, how you will do so. Determining how the priority site or sites relate to the larger community. Identifying what environmental and economic challenges the community faces, and identifying the community's needs. Once you get a good sense of the community needs, you can begin to think about what goals the community would like to achieve and how to best achieve them. For example, what EPA brownfield grant best serves your purposes. Applicants should also consider whether or not they have the capacity to manage a brownfields grant. Once you establish the framework, it will be easier to determine the next steps you need to take. Establish key partnerships. Determine whether your community should apply as an individual or as a coalition. If you are applying as a coalition, identify who will be part of the coalition, who will lead the coalition and manage the cooperative agreement, and who will be coalition members. Also, be sure to discuss what each coalition member's role will be in the program. Once all of that is determined, document your agreement through a memorandum of understanding. Request a letter from your state environmental authority. The letter should indicate that the state is aware that you are submitting an application and that they support it. Obtaining your state environmental authority letter can be done prior to the RFA, but should not be received too far in advance, otherwise it will not be considered current. Get familiar with EPA's Office of Brownfield and Land Revitalization's Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities, or TAB providers. EPA's TAB program provides technical assistance to communities and other stakeholders on brownfield issues with the goal of increasing the community's understanding and involvement in brownfield cleanup and revitalization, and helping to move brownfield sites forward toward cleanup and reuse. To receive free TAB assistance, determine which TAB provider covers your EPA region, and then reach out to that TAB provider. Each of EPA's MARC grants has what is called threshold criteria. These are criteria that all applicants must meet before their applications will even be considered. The first threshold criterion is applicant eligibility. Begin gathering the necessary information to document your entity's specific EPA grant eligibility status. Each grant type has different requirements related to applicant eligibility, so it is critical that you carefully read the guidelines for the specific grant you are applying for and confirm your status with the applicable EPA regional staff. The second primary threshold criterion is site eligibility. If applicable, prepare your defenses to CERCLA liability and request State Environmental Authority determination for petroleum site eligibility. Applicants that are not a federally recognized tribal entity must provide the information required for a petroleum site eligibility determination to their State Environmental Authority so that it can make the necessary determination on petroleum site eligibility. Two particulars of site eligibility include site ownership. For cleanup grant proposals, you must acquire ownership of the site. Remember, applicants must be the sole owner of the site that is the subject of its cleanup grant application in order to be eligible to receive a cleanup grant. For multi-purpose grant proposals, you must own at least one brownfield site in the target area by the proposal submission deadline. Draft analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, or ABCA. For cleanup grant proposals, you must have a draft ABCA. Begin working on your draft ABCA, which briefly summarizes information about the site and contamination issues, cleanup standards, applicable laws, cleanup alternatives considered, and the proposed cleanup remedy. This will allow you to see if critical data gaps exist so you can begin filling them in and have the draft ABCA ready to go by the proposal submission date. As mentioned earlier, applicants are encouraged to review EPA's previous year's grant solicitation guidelines. Those guidelines can be found at the URL provided earlier in this video and can be utilized as a guide to begin gathering information and drafting your application. Pay particular attention to the evaluation criteria, as it will provide you with an overview on how the EPA will score your application. When the RFA is issued and the new guidelines are available, you can then use the time prior to the submission deadline to organize and update the information into the required format, fill in any missing details, and further strengthen the application. While reviewing the evaluation criteria, the applicant can begin to do the following. Develop a grant proposal framework or outline. Applicants should begin by developing a framework or outline for their grant proposal. Think about the story you want to tell about your community and begin gathering the data needed to tell that story. Identify the needs of the community. While the actual language in the new guidelines may vary somewhat from year to year, EPA will be interested in seeing how brownfield sites have impacted your community, particularly sensitive or at-risk populations. You will need to gather data on demographics for the target area, the community, and the state. EPA will also want to know about your community's financial needs and its ability or inability to draw upon other resources to support the assessment and redevelopment of the brownfield sites in their community. Think about these issues and begin gathering specific demographic, environmental, and health data on the target brownfield sites in the community so that you can speak to this topic with some specificity. Describe the program or project. Start working with your brownfield partners to identify and develop the program or project that will be the subject of the grant. Begin discussions early with key partners about the project area and how you envision your program or project operating. Decide the focus of the grant and what sites you want to prioritize. Address the process you will use to prioritize sites if that will be done after the project starts. Start thinking about how many and what type of sites you plan to address with the grant funding and other key aspects of your program. As more details of the program are developed, you should be able to start drafting a budget outlining how much it will cost to perform the work described. In addition, applicants should start looking for ways to leverage additional project funding. Begin tracking these resources so that they can be added to the grant proposal, if required. If leveraged funding already exists for the project, begin gathering documentation, letters, emails, etc., that confirms that leveraged funding. Ask partner organizations that plan to provide resources for letters that document the specific contribution they plan to provide. Gathering these documents early on will save time later and ensure you have the necessary attachments to document your firm leveraged commitments if required by the grant. Engage the community and establish partnerships. Each applicant is required to incorporate community involvement into their grant and to notify the community that they are planning to apply for a brownfields grant. Start working with your community early to establish a process and procedures for engaging your community. These efforts can and should begin well in advance of the grant application. The same goes for establishing partnerships that are critical to the success of your program, such as the applicable EPA regional office. Begin identifying and forming these partnerships early in the brownfields planning process. Identify the project benefits. Begin identifying the health, environmental, economic, and other long-term benefits of addressing brownfield sites in your community. Thinking about the benefits in advance will facilitate your ability to identify and articulate these benefits in your proposal. Demonstrate your capacity. Begin gathering information on any past grants you have received and your accomplishments and performance under these grants. If you had any performance problems on past grants, identify the issues and put in place corrective actions so that any performance issues are resolved by the time you apply for the brownfield grant. Also, think about how you will track and measure the progress of your project if awarded the grant. As you begin your brownfields journey, always remember that the NJIT TAB team is available to provide you with free assistance throughout the brownfields redevelopment process to assure that you achieve your brownfields goals. You can contact us via our hotline at 973-642-4165 or email us at tab@njit.edu. Help is just a call away.